Thank you very much. Well, morning, everybody. Here we go again for Random Ramblings Part 4. I hadn't planned to do quite this many, but we're still going. This will be the penultimate one because if everything goes to plan, we will reopen the house on July the 1st. That's what we're hoping to do. So after that, I won't be able to do any more talks, at least for a little while. We'll open the garden and only the garden for the National Garden Scheme on June the 26th as well. But so the house itself should open, fingers crossed, on July the 1st. Now, this one is going to be in many ways the most personal of all of the talks I've done so far. I use all sorts of different sources to do these talks, but one of them, as you know, has been my father's memoirs. Today's will be sort of leaning quite heavily on that. My father loved this village and loved growing up here, and he would be delighted that everybody is so interested in these stories that he wrote down. So he would be pleased that we're going ahead. He also loved the fact that I did this job, and I'm really here because of his affection for this village. But I say this one might be a bit personal, so I do apologise in places if it gets a bit too personal. Right, here we go, and we are going to start off back in North Lane, outside the Roman Catholic Chapel of St Dunstan. The building itself is probably early to mid 19th century, and it's been a chapel since 1958. The dedication to St Dunstan is not uncommon in this country. Dunstan was a 10th century Archbishop of Canterbury, canonized in 1029. He was also a blacksmith, so he is the patron saint of blacksmiths and goldsmiths and silversmiths and locksmiths and musicians and bell ringers. The early Christian story associated with him is that one day he was working in his forge when the devil rode up and asked Dunstan to shoe his horse. Dunstan made the shoes, but instead of putting them on the horse, he put them on the devil himself and refused to take them off until the devil had promised never to enter a house that had a horseshoe hanging up outside, which is why we put horseshoes on our doors and by our doors today. We have a very big horseshoe outside the front door of the priest house. Points up. This does vary a bit. Some people like it points up, which means that luck is supposed to be caught by the horseshoe. Some people like it points down, which means the good luck falls out on people as they go through the door. It's all personal taste. Our shoe is also held by 7 nails, which is traditional, 7 always being a lucky number, though nobody can quite agree why 7 is a lucky number. The horseshoe has pagan connections as well. Largely because it is a big lump of iron, and iron was always a magical metal. But I say we are well protected one way or another. Now I'm talking about St Dunstan really because in 1895, that is where my great grandparents, Henry and Winifred Ellen Smith, started their first butcher's shop in the village. If you look carefully on the brickworks, you can see where the original front door to the shop was. And there is a lovely picture, which is also in the archive, which shows my great-grandfather standing in the doorway, looking very proud, with his brother-in-law, who was my great-uncle Fred, looking very dapper and hanging on to a brand new shop bike. This is an old-fashioned shop bike with the wicker basket and the painted nameplate, which said Smith's Butchers of West Hoathly, spelt Hoathly, which we talked about last time. But it was Hoathly when they came here, so that's why I really call it Hoathly. Fred Bignell rode that bike for many, many years. He was the meat deliverer. He started off delivering with a horse and cart, but then moved on to the bike. The only time we think he ever left the village for any length of time was when he went to fight in the First World War, when he was on the Western Front. But he rode that bike for about 40 years. In the mid-30s, he was riding it up on Ashdown Forest, when a car pulled up and the driver asked him for directions to the Royal Ashdown Golf Club. The passenger in the back was the Duke of Windsor, who would become Edward VIII. When they got to the golf club, the Prince of Wales said that they would have been later if they hadn't stopped to ask a butcher's boy for directions. Uncle Fred was nearly 70 at that point, and he did make it into the local paper as the world's oldest butcher's boy. My great-grandparents stayed in that shop until 1927, and that's where my grandfather grew up. But in 1927, they moved up the road to a new shop opposite the school, which belonged to the Newnham family. The Newnhams have been running it as a shop, mostly a sweet shop, I think, for several years. But it was a much bigger premises. It had a very large back garden, which had room for pigsties and chicken runs. The shop itself was bigger. It had a cold store. It had a room where they made sausages, which was rather unimaginatively called the sausage room. And it had a glass booth in the center where my great-grandmother sat for many, many years to take the money and keep the books. When my great-grandfather died in 1928, she took over the running of the business. My grandfather actually did the butchery, but she ran the business, and she ran it almost to the day she died in 1963, aged 94. So she was a tough old lady and a genuine Granny Smith. The house that went with the shop was also larger. Most of that house, or part of that house, is now part of Old Timbers. I get that right. But Old Timbers also now includes a separate house that was on the south end. But it was in that house that my father was born in August 1929. And a few years later, he was very handily placed to go to the village school. That school dates from 1874. The first schools in the village, going back to the 18th century, would have been dame schools. We know there were at least 3 in the village, something like 400 in Sussex as a whole. And the dame would really run a childminding service, but she would also teach some of the children their basic letters and numbers. There was a Sunday school in the village in the 18th century as well, which was attached to one of the dissenting chapels. And in 1752, there was a boys' boarding school here, run by the parish clerk, Mr. Bristow Burgery, and his son. And they advertised that they taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, which included fractions and decimals, and algebra, my least favourite subject. In 1795, William Clifford, local landowner, left money in his will to pay for the salary for a village schoolmaster. And that was paid out for several years. So there must have been a school of some sort in the village at that point, although we don't know where it was. But in 1818, his heirs stopped the payments. So you're going back to no school in the village again. This was pretty common. And many landowners were very wary about educating their workers. They thought it was unnecessary and also thought it was quite dangerous to educate the working classes. But by the 1830s, this was beginning to change, and the government were giving grants to establish schools. And in 1837, the local vicar, the new vicar, Mr. Bannerman, he applied for a grant from the government and from the National Society for, excuse me, because I can't remember the name, the National Society for Promoting Education for the Poor, to finance a school. Ultimately, he didn't get any government money, but they did establish the first school here in 1839 on a new site, which was given by Mr. Ellis Bostock, who held the manor in those days, on Church Hill. And it was a single one-room school, always connected with the church. So they taught religious education, they taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and they would teach the girls embroidery. The men and women who came in to teach in the school faced many problems, but the worst was really just getting children to attend. In bad weather, they would stay away. If it was snow, even if it was heavy rain, they wouldn't come. There were always other things for the children to do. There was plenty of work on the farms to be carried out. As late as 1900, local landowners at Old House and Paddock-hurst and St Hill and Brook House were being warned because they kept the older boys away from school to work as beaters on their game shoots. But they did get the children to attend eventually. They also ran into problems with diseases, with measles, with scarlet fever. We know that several children died by the end of the 19th century of scarlet fever. But they kept going. They kept plugging away. They had problems with discipline. Discipline was always enforced with the cane, of course, though only for the boys. They never caned the girls. There were slight improvements at times, and they put the canes away, but it never lasted very long, so they came again. The school still have the canes, at least they did up to a few years ago, but these days they are quite literally museum pieces. But there were improvements. If you look in the parish records here, in the 1840s, only about 50% of the couples getting married in the church could sign their name. By the 1860s, that had gone up to 75%. So literacy was improving in the village. And they were getting more people to attend, more children to attend. And it became clear that that one-room school just was not going to be big enough. So in 1874, the new school was built in North Lane. It was a two-room school, paid for entirely by the village. And that two-room school is still there. The two rooms have been rather surrounded by the later buildings, but they are still in use today. The infants were soon sent back to the Churchill site, as they were seen as rather a drag on the main school. But it did continue to grow. Another building was added, another classroom added in 1890. And in 1901, there was a major rebuilding. They decided to bring the children, the infants, back from Churchill to amalgamate them with the main school. They also brought in the children from the small school out at Tyes Cross. So they joined the main school, which meant new building. And John Godwin King at Stonelands contributed £100 to the building of the new school. Given that the buildings were of sufficient quality and solidly built, they were his conditions, which they were, and they still survive today as well. The school did open again in 1902, in January 1902. It was 3 days late. The main school was ready, but they had trouble with the drainage of the offices being the toilets, which although had a roof, were otherwise open to the elements. So they were pretty basic. And problems with the toilets became something of an underlying story. In 1922, the school had to be closed for 2 weeks because of the insanitary conditions of the offices. I used to be a governor at the school, and at the first induction meeting, we were told that governors should have an overview and not be troubled by problems with the toilets. But of course, we still were, and I imagine that most governors all over the country spend a lot of their time worrying about problems with the toilets, but it is a perennial problem. The 1922 closure was rather sort of symptomatic of a decline in the school, and it led to the retirement of Mr. Williams, who'd been the headmaster for nearly 30 years. He was replaced by Mr. Hazeldine, who really was a new broom and was determined to lift the school up. He opened it all up. He made it more accessible for to the village people. He encouraged people to go in, to see the children's work, to hear them singing, orchestra playing. They performed an operetta, Abu Hassan, in 1927. So it became much more of a village school at that point. Mr. Hazeldine was also very keen on his sport. By 1900, physical exercise, PT, was really just code drill, which meant all the children exercising in long lines in the playground. The boys played a little bit of football and quite a lot of cricket. I think Mr. Williams was very keen on his cricket, but that was about it. Mr. Hazelden kept going with the code drill, and there were lovely photographs of all the pupils being lined up in the playground and doing their physical jerks. He extended the amount of games that they played, football and cricket. They played all the local schools. They did demonstrations of gymnastics in East Grinstead, and he even took 6 of the older boys to Uckfield to do a demonstration of boxing, which you don't tend to get in primary schools these days. But the real stars at that point were the girls. In 1932, they won the county netball championship. They did it again in 1933. They were the first school to win it 2 years running. In 1928, they won the county stool ball championships, beating Alfriston in the final. They did that again in 1932. And in 1933, 34 and 35, they won the local league. Stool ball is always regarded as the Sussex game. It is the Sussex game. It is one of the many sort of bat and ball games that developed alongside cricket. It is still played today. Doesn't get the publicity it deserves really, but it is a good game, and so it has a long association with Sussex. But this sports mad school is where my father went in 1934. So it's no wonder he spent most of his life being completely sports mad himself. And it was a very happy school. School inspectors said it was very encouraging. It had the highest attendance rate, 96% of any school in the district. So it was doing well when he arrived. In his day, when he arrived, it was an all-age school. So the children stayed there until they were 14. Although some of the children would take exams aged 11 to get scholarships for local independent schools. But in 1937, the older children were taken away to schools in East Grinstead. But he was still there when the war broke out in 1939. And the school really saw the first sign of the war in the village when the evacuees started to turn up. There were many evacuees around the village, many of them housed down in Sharpthorne. There were some at Brook House as well. The bulk of them came from a Catholic school in Clapham. But there were problems. Their teacher insisted on having fish on Friday for a start, which was always a little bit of a problem. It always had been a problem in West Hoathly. Getting fish on a Friday during wartime was very difficult. Railways made it easier. Before the railways, fish would have been delivered by dog carts, which were carts pulled by dogs in the early days. Later on, dog carts became a nickname for a small horse-drawn vehicle, very popular in Sherlock Holmes stories. But a dog cart was pulled by a large dog, normally a Newfoundland, and they could pull small loads, perishable loads, faster than a horse could, and they could keep going for longer. So they were used for delivering both in country areas and in cities. But the use of dog carts was banned in Britain in 1841 and was one of the first examples of animal protection legislation in this country. So I did say this was random, so I'm going off piste a bit there. The other problem they had was that the children were not supposed to mix. So it meant they had to share the school, with one school using the school buildings in the morning while the other school had a lesson outside. They then swap over in the afternoons. Now this worked well enough in good weather, but in bad weather, it was no fun having the lesson outside. And this started to cause a bit of resentment. The local children did not like having to be thrown out of their school buildings and having to have these lessons outside. So there was a bit of tension between the two schools. This was really cultural. Most of the West Hoathly children had never been to London. They didn't understand the London children. Most of the children from Clapham had never even seen a garden, let alone the countryside. There are stories of the children just wandering into people's private gardens and pulling up vegetables and picking fruit because they thought it was all countryside and they didn't think the countryside belonged to anybody. So they thought all this produce was free. So that caused problems. And there were fights between the two schools. This was them and us. But it did settle down. And I have met many of the evacuees who came down here. And they do have quite fond memories of the village. Most of them weren't here very long. Most of them went back to London quite quickly. Though 3 families did come down. The parents joined the children here and they settled in the village permanently. But it could not have been easy for any of them, particularly as from the village, it is or was possible to see the red glow in the sky when London burned. Ursula Ridley worked out that this meant that they would have been able to see the Great Fire of London from here as well, which is quite a thought. So the early months of the war were quite chaotic in the village. There were no air raid sirens here. My grandmother used to get a phone call at the shop, normally from Tunbridge, from Turner's Hill, to say whether there was a raid on the way. If there was, she would put a red flag out of the shop window to warn the school, I think on the assumption that there would be at least one child staring out of the school windows at any given time. Once she'd hung up the flag, she would get an old tin hat, get on her bike and ride up a North Lane ringing a bell. She would then turn down the hollow, along to the Viners Cross and up to the village. While Richard Allman from Knaves Acre did the same thing at the north end of the village, and someone else was doing the same thing in Sharpthorne. Quite why they bothered is hard to know. Though some people had cellars to hide in, there were very few air raid shelters at that point, so they didn't have much protection. The school had no air raid shelters. To start with, they would hide the children under the desks, but then someone decided it was better to get them out of the buildings. So they took them over the road and hid them under a large patch of brambles in Bow Pit. Quite what effect this was supposed to have, nobody knew, but they did that for some months before shelters were provided. And so it was all rather chaotic. Dad's army might be an exaggeration, but it is not that much an exaggeration. There was a branch of the Home Guard here, mostly British Legion members, based down the old British Legion Hall in Sharpthorne, I think. And there were ARP wardens here who really did shout, "Put that light out," if they saw a light during the blackout. They shared the hall at the Countess of Huntingdon's connections with the first aid party, which was run by the local doctor. There was a local fire brigade. They had moved out of their original building, which is now the public toilets, and they had a site in Sandy Lane. And at the end of Garden Mead, in the turnaround, there was a big water tank, which was supposed to be their supply for putting out fires, but seems to have seen more use as a swimming pool. So all these strange things did go on, and the WI bottled fruit, and they held sales to raise money for the war effort, and people put on performances to raise money. And Charlotte King had a vegetable stall, and she sold all the surplus vegetables from the gardens at Stonelands. Some of the local landowners even opened up their estates to allow the villagers to help themselves to their pheasants and supplement their diets, which would have been unthinkable in the years before the war. And of course, all of the railings were taken away to be melted down, and you can still see the scars of that around the village today. My grandfather was a member of the Observer Corps, which was important here because of the situation, because of our elevation. This was one of the main posts, all reporting to headquarters in Horsham. The post, which was called T2, was up by the radio mast. It actually is in one of the back gardens of one of the houses of Ridley's. They would plot aircraft movements, pass it on to HQ, And at night, if they heard planes coming, they would put up flares to warn other local sites, other local posts. The post was originally just completely exposed, but they did work out that this made the men vulnerable. So eventually they did sink it into the ground. They concreted it in and put sandbags around it. But it was still quite a hazardous job. One of the things they did was sort of learning aircraft recognition. And this was done in my grandparents' living room with an old magic lantern to show slides. And if he could, my father went in and watched them with his friends. And it was the way of these things that the boys and girls soon got better at recognizing the planes than their parents did. And they would keep their own records. They would spend hours up trees watching planes going overhead. They could watch the dogfights, even while the spent casings were falling around them like rain. My father helped out at the site, although they did have to stop him answering the telephone because Horsham was starting to get a bit curious about the young man with the high-pitched voice. Eventually, they had 18 volunteers at the post, and they did 3-hour shifts in pairs to cover the whole 24 hours. My grandfather normally worked with Lorne Taylor, who'd taken over the running of the newsagent shop in Sharpthorne. But there are many others. Tony Dearden was one. He was a merchant seaman whose ship was sunk in the Atlantic. He was sent here to recuperate after spending 3 days in the water and never left. He was a fine pianist and an accordion player. And on VE Day, he stood with his back against Cumber's cottage and played the accordion for hours while the villagers danced in Queen Square. And in 1941, Bert Pond joined. He had come to the village when his wife became a teacher at West Hoathly School. They moved into one of the Bow cottages next to the shop with their 2 children. And during the holidays, their niece, June, came and she became good friends with my father and his sister. June Pond is my mother. And that is how my parents met when they were 13 or 14 years old. I did say this was going to be personal. Bow cottages belonged to Ursula Ridley. And in 1939, she was approached by Lady Dorothy Macmillan, wife of Harold Macmillan at Birch Grove, to house some refugees, which she did. There were 8 or 9 refugees there in the end, including Walter Kuhnberg, who ran anti-Nazi intelligence networks in Germany and Czechoslovakia, and Vera Polakova, who worked in the Prague network, and she later married Ursula's son, Jasper. In 1940, the house was raided by a special branch, and in Jasper Ridley's memoirs, he said his mother always thought this was one of her neighbours who objected to her left-wing politics, and they sent special branch in. Whether this is true or not, I have no idea. But the evacuees, refugees, sorry, were classified as enemy aliens and were moved out, and they were sent up to London. So the village was quite cosmopolitan at that point. You have refugees from Europe and the evacuees from London and servicemen from New Zealand and Canada. And you also have prisoners of war here. There were German prisoners of war at Brook House in Highbrook, and there was a prisoner of war camp in North Lane. Originally for German prisoners, but it was soon taken over by Italians who were mostly captured in North Africa. They were both low security camps, and the men would go out and work on the local farms. And the Italians certainly played an awful lot of football. They built themselves a football pitch and played football eventually against the children. They were allowed in and they played football and rounders against the prisoners. They had some Italian first division footballers in there. There was a centre forward from Roma and a left back from Bologna. They also had the brother of the former world heavyweight boxing champion, Primo Carnera. Primo Carnera was the biggest, tallest, heaviest heavyweight ever to win the title. He was known as the Gentle Giant or the Ambling Alp. And his brother was built much the same way. And he played centre half, and my father played centre forward. So my father could never get round him. But they learned an awful lot, and they had a good team. The first time they saw anybody do an overhead kick, a bicycle kick, was when they were watching the Italians. They picked up a few tricks. Their favorite one was to get their heaviest player to stand on the opposing goalkeeper's toes at corners so he couldn't get off the ground. I'm not sure whether they learnt that from the Italians or whether they made that one up themselves, but you can't get away with that in the Premier League these days. But they did pretty well. Their best result was a cup match against Lewis, which they won 11-0. My father scored 7 goals. By his own admission, he never did much else, but he did score goals. So they had a good time, but it wasn't all fun. There were problems here. Obviously, we had the bomb dropping and the fatalities in East Grinstead with the Whitehall Cinema. This was Bomb Alley. There were problems here. My father said he remembered listening to the wireless, listening to the BBC News in the evening, and they would report of bombers, German bombers, not being able to get to London and dropping their bombs at random. And random meant this area. So they fell all around here. My father did have a couple of close shaves. On one occasion, he just left the house to go to school in the morning. He heard a plane coming behind him and had a shout from my grandfather. He hit the ground and saw a row of bullets striking the road about 6 feet to his right-hand side, just like they do in the movies. When the plane had gone, he just stood up and brushed himself off and waved to my horrified grandparents to show he was all right and went to school with a good story to tell. On another occasion, an aerial mine fell in Sharpthorne, I think near Cortlands, and these caused most of their damage purely by blast. And just as the blast reached West Hoathly, the district nurse, Nurse Hollands, was approaching the house. And as my father opened the door for her, she came flying through the door. My father was a bit bruised and battered, lying there with the district nurse on top of him with the doorknob in his hand. But other than that, he did seem to quite enjoy getting hit by Nurse Hollands. Poor Nurse Hollands didn't enjoy the experience quite so much, and she was seriously shocked, but not so badly shocked that she couldn't patch my father up and treat his bruises and cuts. They were a tough loss. Of course, later in the war, from June 1944, you get the V1s. Many of them fell around here. There are quite a few on Ashdown Forest. I think the Ashdown Forest Centre still have the remains of one. Several fell in East Grinstead. At least 3 people were killed in East Grinstead. The RAF were tasked with destroying these. They could shoot them down, but that was hazardous as they carried over 1,800 pounds of high explosives. So they got to the method of tipping, where they put their wingtips underneath the wing of the V1 and flicked it over. There were very few planes that could do this, but there were some that were fast enough to catch them. Modern experts said that they did this by turbulence and they couldn't actually touch the planes, but the pilots themselves said they did. But they were a remarkable generation, and some of them paid the price, and some of the worst ended up in East Grinstead with Archibald Mackindoe, the Guinea Pig Club. Mackindoe encouraged the men to get out into the town and not hide away. And he sent his staff into the schools to warn the children of what they might see. And my father remembers seeing the men around the village. They were told to smile at them and to say hello, but not to stare. And that's what they did. To the children, these young men who weren't much more than children themselves were heroes. So they always treated them with respect. And this is why East Grinstead became known as the town that didn't stare.
Antony,
we're running out of time, so I won't stop there.
We're under a minute, so thank you very much.
I'm planning to stop there. So thank you very much for listening to me. And please join me next time for the last talk the last random ramble.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was fascinating. And I'm really sorry to cut you off, but I can see it
I
counting.
know, I could see it coming. I could see it coming. I had to rush the end a bit, but
Yeah, I didn't know how much you could see of me making faces at you, but yeah, it's been saying
no,
a minute for about a minute now.
I was getting the warnings up there. Don't worry.
Well, thank you.
No, I had to cut a few things, but I got there in the end.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to be ambitious and try and say anything, but I hope you'll all join us next time. And we look forward to actually seeing you in person in the museum after July the 1st. That's brilliant news. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Actually cut off.